Today we journey into the blood-soaked trenches of Trench Crusade to explore one of the most harrowing alternate histories ever conceived. Over the next couple hours, we'll uncover the complete story of this grimdark universe, from the moment the Knights Templar committed the ultimate heresy in 1099 to the endless war that has raged for over 8 centuries.
Wait, before the story begins, hit that subscribe button. 99% of viewers aren't subscribed. Let's start the story.
We'll examine the 6 major factions locked in this apocalyptic struggle, the twisted technologies they wield, and the eldritch horrors that stalk the wasteland of no man's land. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this epic journey into a world where hell itself has invaded Earth. Chapter 1. The Act of Ultimate Heresy. In our world, the First Crusade ended in 1099 with the capture of Jerusalem and the establishment of Christian states in the Holy Land. In the world of Trench Crusade, that same year marked the beginning of humanity's darkest hour. When the armies of the Church captured the Holy City, everything seemed to proceed as history intended. But beneath the most sacred of temples, the Knights Templar made a discovery that would doom the world. Deep in secret vaults, hidden since ancient times, they found an artifact of immense and terrible power. The official records describe this as an ancient demonic artifact, though the exact nature of this relic remains shrouded in mystery. What is certain is that this object spoke to the Templars with unholy wisdom, offering them knowledge and power beyond mortal comprehension. The Knights Templar, these warrior monks who had sworn sacred vows to protect the Holy Land, found themselves faced with temptation beyond imagining. Blinded by greed and with weakness festering in their hearts, they fell to their knees before this demonic relic. Rather than resist its corrupting influence as they should have, they saw in it an opportunity for power beyond mortal comprehension. They had found what they believed to be a new lord. Seeing the unholy wisdom that this artifact offered, the Templars began trafficking with devils and committing unspeakable rites. This was the first heresy, the ultimate betrayal of everything they had sworn to protect. Through their corruption and blasphemous rituals, they achieved the unthinkable. They opened a gate of hell directly beneath Jerusalem. The cataclysm that followed defied all description. Jerusalem, the holy city, sacred to 3 great faiths, was utterly destroyed. Where once stood the center of Abrahamic faith, there now yawned a pit of absolute despair, where hell itself bled into the mortal plane. The very fabric of reality was torn, creating a permanent wound in the world through which the legions of damnation could pour forth. The armies of the Church, seeing the horror their own knights had unleashed, had no choice but to retreat. Those Templars who had not participated in the heresy were either killed in the initial cataclysm or fled in horror from their corrupted brethren. Jerusalem became a depraved pit of suffering, a literal hell on earth from which emerged creatures and horrors that had never before walked under the sun. Thus began what would come to be known as the Great War, a conflict that has raged without pause for over 800 years. What started as the First Crusade's triumphant conclusion became humanity's greatest nightmare, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 2. The Year of 3 Battles and Early Conquests. The immediate aftermath of the gates opening was catastrophic beyond measure. By 1101, just 2 years after the initial heresy, the forces of hell had established their dominance over the region in what historians call the Year of 3 Battles. Heretic forces, now reinforced by actual armies from the Third Circle of Hell, conquered most of the Levant in a series of devastating campaigns. The speed of this conquest was unprecedented. Mortal armies, no matter how well trained or faithful, were simply unprepared to face the supernatural horrors that poured from the gate. Demons walked alongside corrupted humans, hellish war machines rumbled across battlefields, and the very air became toxic with infernal influence. Traditional military tactics proved useless against enemies that could regenerate from wounds, summon supernatural fire, or literally terrify men to death with their mere presence. Yet not all was lost. In 1102, the ancient city of Antioch was hastily fortified and became the focal point of resistance against the forces of hell. This would prove to be one of the most crucial decisions in human history, as Antioch's position made it the natural choke point between the hell-controlled territories and the rest of the world. The survivors who reached Antioch were hardened by their experiences, having witnessed firsthand the horrors that humanity now faced. The early years of the war were marked by desperate improvisation. The church had to rapidly develop new tactics, new weapons, and new doctrines to combat an enemy that defied all conventional understanding. Holy water, blessed weapons, and sacred relics were pressed into military service. Priests became battlefield commanders, and monks turned to studying demonology, not for corruption, but for the knowledge needed to fight back. Meanwhile, the Islamic world faced its own crisis. In 1109, in response to the infernal threat, something miraculous occurred. The great sultanate of the invincible Iron Wall of the Two Horns that pierced the sky was formed, and with it came one of God's most direct interventions in the war. The Great Iron Wall of Iskandar, also known as the Iron Wall of Dhu al-Qarnayn, manifested itself in the lands ruled by the Sultan of Rum. This wall was no mere fortification built by human hands, but a divine barrier that protected the Islamic faithful from the heretic hordes. According to Islamic theology within this world, it was the same wall mentioned in the Quran, built by Dhu al-Qarnayn to hold back Gog and Magog. Now it served to protect the faithful from a different apocalyptic threat. The wall's appearance triggered a great migration, as Muslims from across Europa, Asia, and Africa fled to its protection, often dying by the millions along the way as heretic forces preyed upon the refugee columns. But this divine intervention came at a cost. The wall's protection was absolute for those within, but it also meant that the Islamic world became largely isolated from the broader struggle. While this preserved Islamic civilization and allowed their knowledge to flourish, it also meant that the burden of fighting hell's forces fell primarily on the Christian nations of Europe and the other scattered bastions of faith. In 1106, another significant development occurred when Koba became the first tyrant of the 66. This marked the beginning of organized heretic leadership beyond the direct control of hell's demons. The 66 tyrants would become a recurring element in the war, mortal rulers who had been granted power by hell in exchange for their eternal service. These figures combined human cunning with infernal backing, making them particularly dangerous opponents. Chapter 3: The 17 Martyrs and Early Evangelism. One of the most tragic yet inspiring episodes of the early war occurred in 1117, when 17 brave souls undertook what would become known as the most doomed mission in Christian history. These 17 martyrs, driven by unshakable faith and desperate hope, decided to travel directly into the earthly domains of hell itself to convert the heretics back to the light. This mission represented the early church's misunderstanding of what they were truly facing. These holy men believed that the heretics were merely misguided souls who could be brought back to salvation through preaching and example. They could not comprehend that many of the heretics had willingly chosen damnation, and that the lands they sought to enter were now literally infused with hell's power. The 17 martyrs were captured almost immediately upon entering hell's domains, but rather than being simply killed, they were subjected to a fate far worse. The demons and heretics, in their twisted mockery of justice, decided to keep these holy men alive to serve as eternal examples of the futility of faith. They were imprisoned within white-hot brazen bulls, ancient instruments of torture that slowly roast their victims while amplifying their screams. To this day, over 800 years later, The 17 martyrs remain trapped within these hellish devices, kept in a perpetual state of agony that serves both as torture and as a generator of the spiritual energy that powers many of hell's sorceries. Their screams echo across the infernal landscapes, a constant reminder to any who might consider resistance. Yet even in their eternal torment, the 17 martyrs continue to pray, their faith unbroken despite centuries of unimaginable suffering. This event marked a turning point in the Church's understanding of the war. No longer could they view this as a conflict that could be resolved through traditional evangelism or diplomacy. The enemy they faced was not merely misguided, it was actively choosing evil and working to corrupt all of creation. This realization led to the development of more militant doctrines and the acceptance that this war might never end. The fate of the 17 martyrs also established one of the recurring themes of the Trench Crusade universe: the idea that even in ultimate defeat and suffering, faith can endure. Their ongoing torment serves not just as a source of hell's power, but as an inspiration to the faithful who know that even under the worst circumstances possible, these holy men have not renounced their beliefs. Chapter 4: The Wars of Triclavianism and Internal Strife. As if the external threat from hell was not enough, the Church found itself torn apart by internal conflict during one of its darkest periods. The Wars of Triclavianism, spanning from 1215 to 1306, represented a 91-year period when Christianity fought a fierce civil war against itself, while hell's forces steadily expanded their territories. The exact theological disputes that triggered these wars remain complex, but they centered around fundamental questions about the nature of the Trinity and how the Church should respond to the infernal threat. Some factions argued for radical measures, including the use of potentially heretical knowledge to fight fire with fire. Others maintained that only through absolute purity of doctrine could the Church hope to receive divine aid. Still others believed that the opening of Hell's Gate represented God's judgment on humanity, and that repentance, not warfare, was the proper response. These divisions proved catastrophic. While Christian armies fought each other over doctrinal points, heretic domains expanded unchecked. Millions perished by sword and fire in internecine conflicts that served only hell's interests. Cities that had stood firm against demonic assault fell when their defenders were called away to fight fellow Christians. Trade routes collapsed, knowledge was lost, and the demographic catastrophe weakened Christian civilization for generations. The war's name, Triclavianism, suggests it's centered on disputes about the 3 nails of Christ's crucifixion, though the actual theological issues were undoubtedly more complex. What's clear is that these wars represented exactly the kind of division that hell sought to foster among its enemies. By keeping the faithful fighting each other, the forces of darkness could consolidate their gains and prepare for future offensives. The end of the Wars of Triclavianism in 1306 came not through theological resolution, but through sheer exhaustion and the pressing need to unite against external threats. By this time, an entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but religious civil war, and the damage to Christian unity would never be fully repaired. The Church that emerged from this period was more centralized and doctrinally rigid, but also deeply scarred by the memory of its own divisions. This period also saw the rise of more extreme measures within Christianity. The acceptance that traditional methods had failed led to the development of new military orders, new weapons, and new theological justifications for increasingly desperate tactics. The Wars of Triclavianism taught the Church that unity was essential for survival, but it also demonstrated that even faith could be weaponized against itself. Chapter 5: The Black Grail and the Corpse Wars. In 1346, the war took on an entirely new dimension of horror when Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies, and one of Hell's most powerful princes, unleashed his greatest creation upon the world, the Black Grail. This was not merely another plague, but what many consider to be the worst catastrophe in human history, surpassing even the opening of Hell's Gate in its immediate devastating impact. Beelzebub stands apart from the other lords of hell in his methods. While most demons work primarily through mortal intermediaries and political corruption, the Lord of the Flies prefers direct biological warfare. From his putrid fortress in the seventh circle of hell, he had been perfecting the ultimate plague, one that would not merely kill but transform its victims into instruments of further corruption. When the Black Grail was unleashed, it manifested as a literal tidal wave of foulness that emerged from the Hellgate. Demonic hellflies, scorpions, locusts, and other infernal insects poured forth in numbers beyond counting, flowing across the land at startling speed and consuming everything in their path. For 9 days, this swarm of corruption spread across Europe and beyond, leaving indescribable horror in its wake. The Black Grail was indiscriminate in its hatred of all living things. Its infections could spread to virtually any biological matter, causing victims to burst forth with tumors, boils, and weeping pustules. But this was merely the beginning of the horror. If countermeasures were insufficient or came too late, something far worse would occur. The bodies of the infected would lurch to their feet, driven by demonic will. These victims were not truly alive, nor were they traditionally dead. They had become vessels for spreading Beelzebub's corruption, forming warbands that sought to find and infect any remaining life. They retained enough intelligence to use weapons and basic tactics, but their sole purpose was to serve their new master's will. They would gather valuable objects and grisly trophies to place at the feet of hideous idols of Beelzebub that they erected wherever they went. Mockeries of true devotion constructed from the remains of their victims. The corpse wars that followed lasted from 1346 to 1353, 7 years of unrelenting horror as these plague-animated armies swept across Europe. Tens of millions were infected, and traditional military responses proved largely useless against enemies that felt no pain, needed no supplies, and could turn every casualty they inflicted into a new recruit for their ranks. During this period, the very nature of death changed across much of Europe. Burial practices had to be completely reimagined, as traditional graveyards became potential recruitment centers for Beelzebub's forces. Holy fire became essential for disposing of the dead, and entire specialized units were formed to respond to outbreaks with flamethrowers fueled by sacred oils. The war reached its climax at the Battle of Valence in 1429, where one of history's greatest heroines emerged to save Christian Europe. Living Saint Jeanne d'Arc, leading a combined force of French, English, and German armies in an unprecedented display of unity, confronted Yersinia Rex, the great hegemon of Beelzebub. This massive creature, created from the sacrifice of thousands of plague victims, was finally brought down through divine intervention and mortal heroism. The defeat of Yersinia Rex marked the end of the corpse wars in mainland Europe, but at an enormous cost. Beelzebub's rage at this defeat led him to curse his failed followers, casting them out of his Order of the Fly and dooming them to wander the earth as the mourning warbands, eternally lamenting their lost master. These outcasts continue to this day, attacking anyone they encounter in futile attempts to drown out their never-ending sorrow. Not all of Beelzebub's forces were destroyed at Valence. Some of the cult's religious hierarchy, led by high-ranking priests sent directly from the city of Ekron, where Beelzebub's power was strongest, managed to escape the encirclement. Rather than fleeing to Hell's domains, they struck at the city of Avignon, which was opened to them by traitorous elements within the church itself. Chapter 6. The Anti-Papacy of Avignon and Missionary Corruption. The fall of Avignon to Beelzebub's forces represented one of the most shocking betrayals in church history. A cardinal of the city, whose name has been struck from all records, but whose jealousy and ambition are well documented, had grown resentful after being denied the papal throne. In his humiliation and spite, he had secretly converted to the worship of Beelzebub, and when the opportunity arose, he and his hidden cultists opened the city's gates to the retreating forces of the Black Grail. In a single night, the beautiful city of Avignon was transformed into the vilest den of pestilent corruption outside of hell itself. The traitorous cardinal, in a mockery of legitimate papal authority, established an anti-papacy dedicated to Beelzebub. This represented a direct challenge to Rome's spiritual authority and created one of the most disturbing spectacles in Christian history. A city that maintained the outward forms of ecclesiastical government while serving the Lord of the Flies. The anti-papacy of Avignon became the center of a new form of corruption that was perhaps more dangerous than the mindless plague zombies of the Corpse Wars. From this base, Beelzebub began sending forth missionaries of the Black Grail, creatures born from the unholy union of the anti-pope and a Grail-stricken pig. These missionaries were far more intelligent and independent than typical servants of the Black Grail, making them ideal for spreading the cult among willing converts, rather than simply overrunning territories with undead hordes. The missionaries represented a shift in Beelzebub's strategy. Rather than relying solely on biological warfare, they focused on psychological and spiritual corruption. They would appear in towns and villages as seemingly legitimate religious figures, preaching a twisted gospel that promised relief from suffering through embracing decay and corruption. Their silver tongues could convince desperate people that the Black Grail represented not death, but transformation, not horror, but liberation from the pain of existence. These missionary efforts proved disturbingly successful. The number of people willing to voluntarily join Beelzebub's cult was far higher than church authorities wanted to admit. In a world torn apart by centuries of warfare, plague, and supernatural horror, the promise of ending suffering through embracing corruption appealed to many broken souls. Entire communities would sometimes convert willingly, opening their gates to the missionaries and celebrating their own transformation into servants of the Fly Lord. The church was forced to maintain significant military forces around Avignon to contain these missionary activities, both to prevent the corrupt preachers from infiltrating Europe and to stop the disturbing flow of willing converts who sought to join the cult. The fact that people would voluntarily travel to serve Beelzebub represented a theological crisis that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and divine grace. On moonless nights, the music of a million flies can still be heard rolling over Avignon's decaying ramparts as the missionaries prepare for their expeditions. They emerge leading plague almoners, swollen oblates, and thrall monks in twisted processions that mock legitimate religious ceremonies. These expeditions battle against any who refuse to receive what they call the joyous tidings of the Lord of the Flies, spreading both through force and persuasion the gospel of corruption. Chapter 7: Divine Interventions and Mysterious Destructions. Throughout the long history of the Great War, there have been several events that suggest direct divine intervention in human affairs, though these have often been as mysterious and terrible as they have been helpful. The most significant of these occurred in 1477, when the city of Argos was taken by God and is no more. The exact nature of what happened to Argos remains one of the great mysteries of the war. The city simply vanished, leaving behind only a crater and lingering divine energy that made the area uninhabitable for decades afterward. Some theologians believe this was divine judgment on a city that had fallen too deeply into corruption. Others suggest it was a preemptive strike to prevent Argos from becoming another hell-controlled stronghold. Still others theorize that it was an accident of some kind, a divine intervention gone wrong. What's clear is that the destruction of Argos demonstrated that God had not abandoned humanity entirely, but also that divine aid came in forms that mortals could barely comprehend, let alone control. The complete annihilation of a city, regardless of the theological justification, served as a stark reminder that the forces at work in this war operated on scales beyond human understanding. In 1503, another form of divine aid came through more indirect means when war prophet Angelus, guided by Saint Eligius, discovered the formula for orichalcum steel. This miraculous metal proved effective against all missile weapons and became one of the most valuable resources in the war. However, the process for creating orichalcum steel was extremely costly and difficult, requiring both rare materials and specific blessed conditions to forge properly. The discovery of orichalcum steel represented the beginning of a new phase in the war, where supernatural materials and divine inspiration began to supplement traditional military technology. This would later expand into more complex programs of religiously inspired scientific advancement as human civilization adapted to fighting an enemy that operated beyond the normal rules of physics and biology. These divine interventions, while helpful, also established a troubling pattern. God's aid was unpredictable, often destructive to friend and foe alike, and came with no explanations or instructions. The faithful had to learn to accept that divine will operated according to logic they could not fathom, and that sometimes the help they received might be as terrible as the enemies they faced. Chapter 8: The Destruction of Antioch and the Rise of New Antioch. In 1545, disaster struck the primary bastion of Christian resistance when the original city of Antioch was utterly destroyed by a mysterious infernal weapon. This was not a conventional siege or assault, but something far more devastating, a weapon that could annihilate an entire fortified city in moments, leaving behind only a crater filled with lethal demonic essence. The nature of this weapon remains unknown, though many theories have been proposed. Some believe it was a massive demonic spell powered by the sacrifice of thousands of souls. Others suggest it was a hellish war machine built in the infernal foundries of the Third Circle. Still others theorize that it was the result of heretic scientists working with captured angels or stolen divine artifacts. Whatever its nature, the weapon's deployment marked a significant escalation in Hell's capabilities. The immediate aftermath of Antioch's destruction was catastrophic for Christian morale. The city had stood as the primary symbol of resistance against Hell's forces for over 4 centuries. Its walls had never been breached, its garrison had never surrendered, and its fall seemed to herald the beginning of the end for Christian civilization. Refugees fled westward in panic, spreading tales of the city's instant annihilation and the terrible crater that had been left behind. But the garrison of Antioch did not give up, even in the face of total destruction. Despite the lethal demonic essence that emanated from the crater where their city had once stood, the surviving defenders held their positions in the ruins. They established fortified camps around the perimeter of the destruction zone, maintaining their vigil even as the demonic radiation slowly poisoned them. This act of supreme sacrifice and dedication became legendary throughout Christian Europe. In 1559, the Sword Congress of Vienna made one of the most important decisions in the war's history. Antioch would be rebuilt. The new city, christened New Antioch, would be constructed as close to the original site as safety permitted, serving as both a military fortress and a symbol that Christian civilization would not be broken by any weapon hell could devise. The construction of New Antioch was a massive undertaking that required the cooperation of all Christian nations. The Sword Congress decreed that every faithful nation would send a yearly tithe equivalent to 1/10 of their revenue to support the new fortress city. This levy was usually paid in supplies, weapons, ammunition, and trained soldiers rather than coin, making New Antioch truly an international effort. The new city was designed from the ground up as the ultimate fortress against Hell's forces. Its walls incorporated lessons learned from 4.5 centuries of warfare, using both traditional fortification techniques and new methods developed specifically for fighting supernatural enemies. Sacred symbols were worked into the very stones. Blessed weapons were built into the defenses, and the entire city was consecrated as holy ground to make it as inhospitable as possible to demonic forces. New Antioch quickly became more than just a military fortress. It served as the focal point for Christian technological and theological advancement, housing the most advanced workshops, libraries, and research facilities in the Christian world. The city's strategic position at the very edge of Hell's shadow made it the ideal location for studying the enemy and developing new countermeasures. The gold ducat of New Antioch became the most widely traded currency among the faithful nations, reflecting the city's central role in the war economy. Each ducat was minted to show the profile of the current Duke of New Antioch on one side and the heraldry of the contributing nation on the other, symbolizing the international unity required to maintain this crucial bastion. For 300 years, New Antioch has stood as the home of all our hopes, the first line of defense against Hell's forces and the symbolic heart of Christian resistance. Its walls have never been breached, despite countless furious assaults, and it remains unconquered to this day. The city has become a proving ground for warriors from across the Christian world, drawing the bravest and most skilled fighters to serve in its defense. Chapter 9. The Meta-Christ Program and Scientific Theology. One of the most controversial and remarkable developments in the Christian response to Hell's invasion was the establishment of what became known as the Meta-Christ Program. This extraordinary theological and scientific endeavor was initiated by Gregor Mendel, the renowned geneticist and Catholic monk whose work would fundamentally alter the nature of Christian warfare. The historical Gregor Mendel lived in the 19th century, but in the world of Trench Crusade, his counterpart began his groundbreaking work much earlier. Some scholars suggest his work may have begun as early as the 17th century, though the exact timeline remains debated. This Mendel combined deep religious faith with scientific genius, believing that God had provided humanity with the tools to fight back against Hell's supernatural advantages, but that these tools required human intelligence and dedication to unlock. Mendel's great breakthrough came from a profound theological question that would reshape Christian warfare. The exact source of the genetic material used in the Meta-Christ program remains classified, though some theological scholars theorize it may have been derived from sacred relics preserved since Christ's time. What is certain is that this program involved creating genetic clones that served as the basis for the communicants, superhuman warriors who possessed enhanced physical capabilities and an innate resistance to demonic influence. The process of creating communicants was both scientifically complex and spiritually demanding. Each Meta-Christ clone had to be carefully cultivated under specific conditions, blessed by high-ranking clergy, and subjected to extensive theological education to ensure their spiritual purity. The resulting beings were not merely genetically enhanced humans, but warriors who possessed an actual spiritual connection to the divine that made them formidable opponents of Hell's forces. Communicants became some of the most effective soldiers in the Christian arsenal. Their enhanced strength, speed, and endurance made them capable of feats that would be impossible for normal humans. More importantly, their spiritual nature made them capable of wielding blessed weapons with extraordinary effectiveness and gave them natural resistance to many forms of demonic attack. They could wade through battlefields that would drive normal men insane, face down horrors that would break mortal minds, and continue fighting even when gravely wounded. The Mendelist Order, the monastic brotherhood that oversees the Meta-Christ program, became one of the most secretive and powerful organizations within the church. These monk scientists combined deep religious devotion with cutting-edge genetic research, working in heavily fortified monasteries to produce the next generation of Christian super soldiers. Their work required not only scientific expertise, but also profound spiritual preparation, as they were literally handling what they believed to be the genetic material of the Son of God. The ethical implications of the Meta-Christ program have been debated by theologians for centuries. Critics argue that attempting to clone Christ represents a form of blasphemy, that humanity should not presume to recreate God's unique sacrifice. Supporters counter that God has provided humanity with both the materials and the knowledge necessary for this work, and that failing to use these gifts in the face of hell's invasion would itself be a sin. The program has not been without its failures and controversies. Not all Metachrist clones develop properly, and some have been corrupted during the creation process, requiring their destruction. There have been incidents where communicants have been captured by Hell's forces and subjected to horrific corruption rituals. These failures serve as constant reminders of the risks involved in this most sacred of scientific endeavors. Despite these challenges, the Metachrist program has provided Christianity with some of its most effective weapons against Hell's supernatural forces. Communicants serve not only as elite soldiers, but as symbols of hope, living proof that humanity has not been abandoned by God and that divine power can still manifest in the world through human agency and faith. Chapter 10: The Iron Sultanate and the Great Wall. While Christianity struggled with internal divisions and external assaults, the Islamic world found its own path to survival through divine intervention and unified resistance. The formation of the Great Sultanate of the invincible Iron Wall of the Two Horns that pierced the sky in 1109 represented one of the most remarkable success stories of resistance against Hell's expansion. The Great Iron Wall of Iskandar, also known as the Iron Wall of Dhu al-Qarnayn, appeared through what Muslims recognized as direct divine intervention. According to Islamic theology within this world, this was the same wall mentioned in the Quran, built by the historical Dhu al-Qarnayn, Alexander the Great in some interpretations, to hold back Gog and Magog until the end times. When Hell's gates opened and demonic forces began their conquest, Allah manifested this divine barrier to protect the faithful. The wall itself defies conventional understanding of fortification. It is not merely a physical barrier, but a spiritual one, imbued with divine power that makes it impenetrable to heretic forces. The wall stretches across impossible distances, protecting the Islamic heartland in Persia and Mesopotamia from the expanding tide of corruption. Those who attempt to breach it without divine permission find themselves turned back by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The appearance of the Iron Wall triggered one of the largest migrations in human history. A call went out to all Muslims to seek refuge behind the divine barrier. And over the coming decades, millions of faithful made the perilous journey across Europa, Asia, and Africa. These refugee columns were constantly harassed by heretic forces, who saw them as both prey and potential converts. Entire armies of demons and corrupted humans would swarm the migration routes like locusts, building vile monuments from the bodies of those they killed to prevent proper Islamic burial. Despite these horrific losses, enough refugees reached the Iron Wall to establish a strong Islamic civilization within its protection. The Great Sultanate became a unique state, combining the best elements of various Islamic cultures while maintaining strict unity in the face of external threats. The Sultan of Rum became the paramount ruler, but the government incorporated traditions and knowledge from across the Islamic world. Within the Iron Wall's protection, Islamic civilization flourished in ways that would have been impossible in the war-torn outside world. The House of Wisdom was re-established, becoming the center of learning and research for the Islamic world. Here, scholars worked to preserve and expand upon the knowledge of the ancients while developing new technologies and techniques specifically for fighting Hell's forces. The Jabirian alchemists became one of the Sultanate's most distinctive and powerful institutions. These masters of esoteric arts combined traditional Islamic alchemy with new discoveries about the nature of Hell's forces. They learned to control fire and ice, metal and liquid, creating intricate mechanical devices and even artificial life forms. Their most famous creations were the Jabirian battle lions, artificial creatures that combined the ferocity of living predators with the resilience of alchemical constructs. The Sultanate's military was built around the concept of merit-based leadership and diverse tactics. Field officers, known as Yüzbaşı, were selected solely based on their abilities, with no consideration given to family pedigree or wealth. This created a professional military class that was both competent and loyal to the Sultanate's ideals, rather than to individual nobles. The legendary assassins also found new purpose within the Sultanate. These mystical warriors, drawing on traditions that predated the Hell invasion, developed supernatural abilities that allowed them to bend space and time using sacred rituals and powerful hallucinogens. An assassin could seemingly appear in two places simultaneously, strike with impossible speed, and then travel back in time to avoid retaliation. These abilities made them perfect for operations outside the Iron Wall, where they could hunt heretic leaders and gather intelligence from Hell's domains. The Sultanate's isolation behind the Iron Wall was both a blessing and a burden. While it protected Islamic civilization from the worst horrors of the Great War, it also meant that the Islamic world became largely separated from the broader struggle. This created a complex relationship with the Christian nations, who sometimes resented the Sultanate's safety, while also recognizing the value of having at least one major power preserved from Hell's corruption. Military expeditions over the Great Iron Wall into no man's land carried enormous risks, but they were necessary to maintain contact with the outside world and to prevent heretic forces from massing too close to the wall itself. These expeditions became proving grounds for the Sultanate's warriors, who would venture into the hellish wasteland to test their skills against the damned. The Sultanate developed its own unique approach to combating Hell's forces, one that emphasized mobility, alchemical warfare, and precision strikes rather than the grinding attrition that characterized much of the European fighting. The Azebs, soldiers recruited from every province of the Sultanate, were trained in loose formations and mobile tactics that allowed them to strike quickly and withdraw before Hell's more powerful units could respond. Chapter 11. The Heretic Legions and the Domains of Damnation. While the forces of Hell included actual demons and supernatural creatures, the backbone of their military might came from human beings who had chosen to serve darkness. The Heretic Legions represented perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Great War. The millions of people who had willingly abandoned God and embraced damnation in exchange for power, survival, or simply escape from suffering. The process of joining the Heretic Legions was itself a form of damnation. Those who wished to serve Hell's forces had to make an unholy pilgrimage to the burning bronze gates of Hell itself. This journey was designed to test not just physical endurance but spiritual corruption. The infernal heat emanating from Hell's gates could be felt from leagues away, searing both flesh and spirit until the pain became unbearable. The Valley of Tears, the great road leading to Hell's Gate, was paved with wailing souls and lamentations, littered with endless mounds of charred bodies. Many of these corpses were still half alive, writhing in agony, trapped in a grotesque twilight between life and death. These were the rejected souls, those whose wickedness was deemed insufficient for Hell's purposes. They were doomed to writhe in agony until the day of judgment, serving as both warning and encouragement to those who sought to join Hell's ranks. Only those who could approach within sight of Hell's maw were considered worthy of initiation. These survivors were inducted into the legions through unbreakable vows that chained them to darkness for all eternity. Their bodies were branded with the mark of whichever Devil Lord had claimed them, and they were equipped from Hell's own armories with weapons and armor crafted in the infernal foundries. The structure of the Heretic Legions reflected Hell's own hierarchies. At the top were the heretic priests, fallen clergy who had abandoned their sacred vows to serve demon lords like Pazuzu or Guison. These corrupted spiritual leaders could perform unholy magics, summoning demons and casting spells that could cause the ears to bleed and eyeballs to burst from their sockets. Their recitation of profane gospels represented a deliberate inversion of Christian worship, designed to both empower Hell's forces and terrorize the faithful. Below the priests were various specialized units, each serving specific roles in Hell's war machine. Heretic death commandos were silent killers equipped with stealth generators that could hide them from the eyes of God himself. These terrifying infiltrators were capable of eliminating entire enemy squads single-handedly, appearing from nowhere to strike and then vanishing before retaliation could arrive. The heretic choristers represented one of the most disturbing aspects of Hell's forces. These were individuals who had embraced suicide as a weapon, using their own deaths to power demonic magics or to spread corruption among their enemies. Suicide being a mortal sin, their willing embrace of it demonstrated the complete spiritual corruption that Hell's service demanded. The bulk of the Heretic Legions consisted of heretic troopers, regular soldiers who had witnessed the gate of Hell and survived the experience. This exposure to Hell's raw power had damned them for all eternity, but it had also hardened them beyond normal human endurance. They fought with the desperate fury of the damned, knowing that defeat would bring not death but eternal torment. Anointed heavy infantry represented the elite of the mortal heretic forces. These warriors had made multiple pilgrimages to Hell and back, their skin burned and blistering from repeated exposure to infernal energies. Each journey had increased their power while further corrupting their souls, creating warriors who were no longer entirely human, but retained enough of their original nature to serve as effective military leaders. The Heretic Legions were supplemented by various supernatural creatures created or summoned by Hell's powers. War wolves were abominations specifically designed to charge through miles of barbed wire, their specially formed heads capable of cutting clean through defensive obstacles. These creatures wore unique armor forged in Hell's own factories, bearing maker's marks that proclaimed their infernal origin. Artillery witches stalk the battlefields as living weapons, hurling ordnance assembled in the death factories of Hell's third circle. These silent figures were completely mute, and no one had ever seen their faces. Some questioned whether they were even truly alive, suggesting they too had been manufactured in Hell's workshops like the weapons they carried. The territories controlled by the Heretic Legions had been transformed into literal earthly domains of Hell. Spies sent into these lands under special absolution from the Cardinal Protector rarely returned, and those who did brought back tales of unimaginable horror. They spoke of firstborn children being cast into the mouths of burning statues of Baal, of human flesh being sold by the pound in dreadful markets, and of great idols of the golden calf, before which rapturous men and women prostrated themselves while carving away layers of their own flesh in ecstatic offering. These domains featured inverted pyramids and towers that plunged deep into the earth, built of iron and black stone. The very architecture seemed designed to mock divine creation, with structures that defied normal engineering principles and served purposes that mortal minds could barely comprehend. Cities in these lands became centers of corruption, where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. Chapter 12. The Court of the Seven-Headed Serpent. At the apex of Hell's hierarchy stood the Court of the Seven-Headed Serpent, the organizational structure through which the demons themselves directed the war against creation. In the Iron City of Dis, located in the sixth circle of Hell, sat the Infernal War Council, coordinating Hell's efforts from a shrieking black keep whose towers reached impossible heights. The court was ruled by 7 archdevils, each representing one of the 7 deadly sins made manifest. These were the heads of the serpent: wrath, envy, pride, gluttony, greed, sloth, and lust. Each commanded vast legions and possessed power that dwarfed even the mightiest mortal heroes. Yet the court was plagued by the same sin that had originally caused Lucifer's fall: pride and the constant struggle for dominance. The hierarchy of the court was anything but stable. Only Mammon, the serpent head of greed, was said to have held his position almost without interruption throughout the war's 8th-century duration. The other positions changed hands regularly as the archdevils plotted against each other, formed temporary alliances, and engaged in the kind of political backstabbing that would make mortal courts seem peaceful by comparison. This internal strife was both Hell's greatest strength and its most significant weakness. The constant competition drove each archdevil to greater extremes of cruelty and innovation, resulting in increasingly horrific weapons and tactics being deployed against the faithful. However, it also meant that Hell's forces were rarely coordinated effectively, with different factions working at cross purposes or even directly sabotaging each other's efforts. Towering statues of the current serpent heads were constantly being erected in dice by slavering work gangs of yoke fiends, only to be torn down and crushed to rubble when new devil lords rose to power. This endless cycle of construction and destruction reflected the court's inability to maintain stable leadership for extended periods. The demons of the court possessed abilities that defied mortal understanding. They were immune to fire, naturally, given their origins in Hell's flames. More significantly, they wielded Heretic powers, a form of magic that could bend reality itself, but required constant fuel in the form of mortal suffering. This created an endless hunger for warfare, torture, and corruption, as the demons needed fresh sources of pain and despair to maintain their supernatural abilities. When the gate of Hell was first opened, it was the court's warbands that poured out to begin the conquest of the Levant. These initial forces crushed mortal armies with contemptuous ease, treating human resistance like fire-burning dry chaff. Only the fortifications at Antioch and the divine intervention of the Iron Wall managed to check their advance, and even then at terrible cost. The court's foot soldiers were beings that existed simultaneously in both the material world and the spirit world, making them partially immune to conventional weapons while allowing them to strike at their enemies' souls as well as their bodies. Hell Knights served as the court's primary military units, elite warriors who combined fearsome combat abilities with the power to cast goetic spells. Below them were the yoke fiends, fallen angels who had been reduced to slavery and served as both cannon fodder and beastmasters for Hell's armies. The court's approach to warfare was characterized by overwhelming supernatural power combined with deliberate psychological terror. They understood that defeating humanity required not just military victory, but the complete demoralization of their enemies. To this end, they employed weapons and tactics specifically designed to inspire despair and hopelessness. Despite their individual power, the demons of the court faced significant limitations in their earthly operations. The continued existence of divine power in the world meant that God's omnipotence would eventually reassert itself, limiting the demons' ability to permanently alter reality. This forced them to work quickly when deploying their most powerful abilities and created an ongoing need for mortal agents who could operate more freely in the physical world. The court's relationship with their mortal servants was complex and often contradictory. While they needed human agents to carry out their will on Earth, they also viewed mortals with contempt and were prone to destroying their own followers on whims or in fits of rage. This created an atmosphere of terror even within Hell's own ranks, where serving too well could be as dangerous as serving poorly. Chapter 13. The Cult of the Black Grail and Beelzebub's Plague. Among all of Hell's horrors, none proved more persistently devastating than the cult of the Black Grail and the ongoing threat of Beelzebub's Plague. While the initial corpse wars had ended in 1429 with the defeat of Yersinia Rex, the Black Grail itself was never truly destroyed, continuing to manifest in outbreaks that could devastate entire regions without warning. The city of Ekron served as the earthly headquarters of Beelzebub's power, a place so thoroughly corrupted that it had become a literal hive filled with locusts, worms, scorpions, and other cursed insects. The city was rebuilt from ruins using the foul power of the Prince of Gluttony, creating a nightmarish metropolis that even other heretic factions avoided. According to reports from the few spies who had observed it from a distance, Ekron was filled with treasures and works of art brought from around the world, not for their beauty, but because Beelzebub fed on the worship and admiration these objects had received. The Black Grail plague itself was far more sophisticated than a simple disease. When Beelzebub periodically gained supremacy in Hell's power struggles, he would unleash fresh waves of the plague by opening the gates of his putrid fortress and releasing torrents of demonic insects. These swarms would flow across the land for exactly 9 days before exhausting themselves by devouring their own kind in insatiable hunger. The plague was indiscriminate in its hatred of all living things, capable of infecting virtually any biological matter. Victims would burst forth with tumors, boils, and weeping pustules, but this was only the beginning. If countermeasures failed or came too late, the bodies of the infected would rise again as undead servants, driven by demonic will to spread the corruption further. What made the Black Grail particularly dangerous was its adaptability and intelligence. Unlike mindless undead, those infected retained enough of their original consciousness to use weapons, employ tactics, and even perform complex tasks. They would gather valuable objects and construct grotesque idols of Beelzebub from the remains of their victims, creating centers of corruption that could serve as rally points for further outbreaks. The Order of the Fly, composed of those depraved enough to willingly embrace the Black Grail, represented the cult's human leadership. These plague knights had chosen damnation of their own free will, and in exchange for their devotion, Beelzebub granted them weapons, armor, and equipment corrupted by his personal touch. They served as both military commanders and spiritual leaders for the mindless infected hordes. Lords of Tumors held the highest ranks within the cult's nobility, serving as direct conduits for Beelzebub's will. Through trance-like ecstasy, they could commune directly with the Lord of the Flies and channel the power of Hell's seventh circle. Their very presence could spread corruption among both friend and foe, making them walking biological weapons. The cult's most horrifying creations were the heralds of Beelzebub, beings who had undergone the black honor of being melded with hellflies. This torturous metamorphosis transformed them into grotesque winged insects made of bloated flesh, their vestigial human bodies slowly being consumed from within, while their minds remained conscious and aware of their fate. These creatures served as scouts and advance forces, their ear-numbing drone capable of breaking enemy morale before battle was even joined. Specialized units had been developed by various nations to combat Black Grail outbreaks. New Antioch and the Free State of Prussia maintained flamethrower tanks using holy anointing oil as fuel, capable of purifying large areas of infection. These units were among the most dangerous assignments in the war, as their crews faced not only the infected hordes, but the toxic spiritual corruption that surrounded major outbreaks. The psychological impact of the Black Grail extended far beyond its immediate victims. The knowledge that any battlefield casualty could potentially rise again as an enemy created a constant atmosphere of paranoia and despair. Traditional military medicine became complicated by the need to ensure that wounded soldiers were not becoming vectors for infection, and battlefield protocols had to account for the possibility that the dead might not stay dead. The cult's missionary activities, centered on the corrupted city of Avignon, represented a different but equally dangerous threat. The missionaries of the Black Grail, born from the union of the anti-pope and a Grail-stricken pig, possessed human-level intelligence combined with supernatural persuasiveness. They could convince desperate people that embracing corruption represented salvation rather than damnation, preying on the despair that 8 centuries of warfare had created. The ongoing threat of the Black Grail forced fundamental changes in how human civilization operated. Burial practices, medical procedures, urban planning, and even agricultural techniques had to be modified to account for the possibility of plague outbreaks. The fact that Beelzebub could unleash fresh waves of infection at any time meant that no victory against his forces was ever truly permanent. Chapter 14. The Trench. Pilgrims and popular faith. Not all of Christianity's military response to Hell's invasion came through official church channels or organized military units. The Trench Pilgrims represented the grassroots religious response to the crisis. Disorganized groups of Christian faithful led by alleged prophets or driven by personal visions to take up arms against the forces of darkness. These pilgrims emerged from all walks of life, united not by formal military training or official sanction, but by shared faith and desperate courage. Many were civilians who had lost everything to Hell's forces and sought redemption through holy warfare. Others were soldiers who had become disillusioned with conventional military approaches and sought a more direct spiritual path to victory. The Trench Pilgrims were characterized by their extreme religious devotion and their willingness to embrace martyrdom in service of their cause. They saw the Great War not merely as a political or territorial conflict, but as the literal end times, a final battle between good and evil that would determine the fate of all creation. This perspective gave them a fearless intensity that made them formidable opponents despite their lack of formal organization. War prophets served as the informal leaders of Trench Pilgrim groups, claiming direct divine revelation and the ability to interpret God's will for their followers. These figures were often charismatic individuals who had experienced visions or miraculous events that convinced them they had been chosen for holy purposes. Their authority came not from institutional appointment, but from their ability to inspire others through their personal faith and apparent divine favor. The cavalcade of the 10th plague represented one of the most distinctive Trench Pilgrim traditions. Before battle, these warriors would sacrifice lambs and anoint themselves with the blood to ward off God's wrath, drawing holy symbols on their bodies, clothing, and armor. They would then march to battle singing hymns, convinced that the blood of the lamb would shield them from harm. This practice, while theologically controversial, seemed to provide genuine spiritual protection in many cases. Trench Pilgrims were known for their improvised but effective weapons and tactics. Unable to rely on standardized military equipment, they made do with whatever they could find, often blessing makeshift weapons with holy water or incorporating religious relics into their gear. Their battles became as much spiritual warfare as physical combat, with prayers and hymns accompanying every charge and blessing every weapon. The shrine anchorites represented the most extreme expression of Trench Pilgrim devotion. These were monks who had themselves welded shut inside massive iron constructs, enduring constant pain from spike-lined interiors as a form of self-flagellation. The chants, cries, and prayers echoing from these walking shrines could drive other pilgrims into religious frenzies, making them nearly unstoppable in battle despite their individual weaknesses. Castigators served as the disciplinary force within Trench Pilgrim groups, ensuring that religious observance remained strict and that any signs of spiritual weakness were immediately addressed. These figures combined the roles of military police and religious inquisitors, maintaining both martial discipline and theological purity within their ranks. The Trench Pilgrims' relationship with official church hierarchy was often complicated. While their devotion was unquestionable, their independent nature and tendency toward extreme interpretations of doctrine sometimes put them at odds with established religious authority. Some church leaders viewed them as valuable allies whose faith could inspire others, while others saw them as dangerous fanatics whose actions might discredit legitimate religious efforts. Despite their lack of formal training, Trench Pilgrims often proved surprisingly effective in combat against Hell's forces. Their absolute faith seemed to provide genuine protection against demonic influence, and their willingness to sacrifice everything for their cause made them immune to the fear and despair that Hell's forces relied upon to break enemy morale. The Pilgrims' camps became centers of intense religious activity, with constant prayer, confession, and religious instruction taking place alongside military preparation. These communities developed their own traditions and customs, often incorporating elements from local folk religion alongside official church doctrine. The phenomenon of Trench Pilgrims demonstrated that the Great War had become more than just a military conflict. It had evolved into a spiritual crusade that engaged the faith and devotion of ordinary people across Christian Europe. Their presence on battlefields served as a constant reminder that this war was ultimately about the survival of faith itself, not just political territories or strategic advantages. Chapter 15: Technological and Supernatural Innovation. The Great War's 8-century duration forced all sides to develop increasingly sophisticated weapons and tactics to gain advantages over their enemies. This arms race combined traditional military engineering with supernatural elements, religious inspiration, and forbidden knowledge acquired from captured enemies or dangerous sources. Christian nations led the way in conventional military technology, with the Church establishing a space program as early as 1899, an achievement that demonstrated the advanced industrial capacity that had developed in response to the war's demands. This program was likely connected to the need for better reconnaissance of Hell's territories, and the development of weapons that could strike at infernal targets from beyond the reach of demonic retaliation. The Free State of Prussia emerged as a leader in military innovation, developing the first Stoßtruppen, elite shock troopers who served as the model for modern special forces. These soldiers were selected from the very best candidates, unmarried men under 25, who demonstrated extreme athletic ability and aggression in battle. They were trained in synchronized fireteam tactics and combined arms warfare, though their casualty rates were correspondingly high. Tank warfare appeared surprisingly early in this timeline, with heretic forces deploying armored vehicles by 1894 as part of their massive offensive following the Year of Broken Trinity. These machines were likely powered by infernal engines and crewed by damned souls who felt no fear of death, making them particularly effective against conventional forces unprepared for such innovations. Submarine warfare also developed ahead of its historical timeline, with heretic scientists aided by the demon Marbas constructing the first modern submarines in secret by 1866. These vessels were launched from Gibraltar to prey on merchant shipping, causing widespread famine as supply lines were disrupted. The submarines were likely powered by supernatural means and crewed by beings that did not require air to survive. The discovery of auric alchem steel in 1503 marked the beginning of supernatural material science. This miraculous metal, revealed through divine inspiration to war prophet Angelus, proved effective against all missile weapons, but required extremely costly and complex production processes. The metal had to be forged under specific blessed conditions using rare materials, making it available only for the most critical applications. Chemical warfare took on particularly horrific dimensions in this conflict, with gas weapons being developed that could affect not just the body, but the soul itself. Some chemical agents were designed to cause spiritual corruption rather than physical death, potentially turning victims into willing servants of hell. Specialized gas masks and protective equipment had to be blessed by clergy to provide protection against these supernatural weapons. The Jabirian alchemists of the Iron Sultanate developed perhaps the most sophisticated supernatural technology of any faction. These masters combined traditional Islamic alchemy with new understanding of Hell's forces, learning to create artificial life forms and mechanical devices that operated according to principles unknown to conventional science. Their Jabirian battle lions represented the pinnacle of this technology, combining the ferocity of living predators with the durability of alchemical constructs. Hell's forces relied primarily on Goetic magic to power their weapons and equipment. These reality-bending powers required constant fuel in the form of mortal suffering, creating weapons that grew stronger as they inflicted pain. Demonic rifles could fire bullets that existed simultaneously on Earth and in Hell, making conventional cover ineffective against them. Artillery shells could be summoned from Hell's foundries mid-flight, appearing directly above their targets without following ballistic trajectories. The development of specialized anti-supernatural weapons became a major focus of research for all faithful factions. Holy ammunition was developed that could disrupt demonic essence, while blessed weapons could bypass Hell's supernatural defenses. Flamethrowers using consecrated oils became standard equipment for dealing with undead and plague outbreaks. Medical technology had to adapt to treat wounds that affected both body and soul. Traditional battlefield medicine was insufficient when dealing with demonic corruption, spiritual possession, or supernatural diseases. New techniques were developed that combined conventional surgery with exorcism, blessing, and other religious procedures. Communication technology took on new importance as the war's scale expanded. Traditional methods of battlefield communication were often disrupted by supernatural interference, requiring the development of blessed telegraph lines, consecrated radio equipment, and other technologies that could function reliably despite demonic influence. The arms race showed no signs of slowing, as each side's innovations forced their enemies to develop countermeasures, which in turn required new innovations to overcome. This cycle of technological advancement had transformed the war from a medieval religious conflict into something resembling science fiction, with weapons and tactics that would have been unimaginable when the conflict began. Chapter 16: The Modern Era and Recent Developments. By 1914, 815 years after the opening of Hell's Gate, the Great War had evolved into a conflict that bore little resemblance to its medieval origins. The introduction of modern industrial warfare, combined with centuries of supernatural innovation, had created a battlefield environment of unprecedented horror and complexity. The landscape across the Middle East, Anatolia, and much of Eastern Europe had been utterly devastated by centuries of warfare. The original topography had been obliterated and replaced by an endless expanse of mud, trenches, and shell craters that stretched for thousands of miles. This wasteland, known as no man's land, had become a hellscape where the normal rules of geography, physics, and biology no longer applied. Trench networks had grown into vast underground cities, some extending hundreds of miles and reaching depths that approached the borders of hell itself. These subterranean fortifications housed entire armies, complete with workshops, hospitals, command centers, and spiritual facilities needed to maintain morale in the face of constant supernatural threat. The deepest trenches required special blessing and warding to prevent demonic infiltration from below. The war's scale had expanded far beyond its original Middle Eastern focus. Ireland had fallen to a major heretic invasion during the 19th century, forcing England to construct the moving fortress Britannia as its primary naval defense after the destruction of most of the Royal Navy at the Battle of the Bloodied Cliffs. Scotland and England remained separate kingdoms, as they had never had the luxury of peaceful unification while facing constant external threats. The Free State of Prussia had evolved into one of Europe's most democratic nations, a republic rather than a monarchy, whose military innovations had been crucial to Christian survival. Their Stoßtruppen represented the pinnacle of conventional military training, while their flamethrower tanks provided essential capabilities for dealing with supernatural threats. Colonial expansion had been largely impossible for European powers, as the constant threat of Hell's forces prevented the luxury of overseas adventures. This had allowed many African, Asian, and American civilizations to develop along different paths than in our timeline. The Solomonic Empire of Abyssinia had become a major military power, fielding expeditionary forces that were masters of mobile warfare and specialists in fighting Hell's forces on the African continent. The Hebrew Knights had emerged from centuries of secrecy to become active participants in the war, operating from hidden fortresses and specializing in targeted strikes against key heretic installations. Their 1703 assault on the Templar stronghold at Acre represented one of the war's most daring special operations, demonstrating that even Hell's most fortified positions could be vulnerable to determined attack. Naval warfare had been revolutionized by the introduction of supernatural elements. Heretic submarine fleets, crewed by beings that did not need to breathe, could operate indefinitely underwater and strike without warning. Christian navies had been forced to develop new detection methods and weapons capable of destroying vessels that operated according to non-physical principles. The economic impact of 8 centuries of total war had fundamentally altered how human civilization operated. Entire industries existed solely to support the war effort, while others had been forced to adapt their processes to account for supernatural threats. Agriculture had to be conducted in fortified settlements, with crops blessed against corruption and harvest schedules adjusted to avoid peak periods of demonic activity. The social structure of Christian Europe had been militarized to a degree unknown in our timeline. Every aspect of society was organized around the war effort, from childhood education that included basic combat training and spiritual preparation to old-age homes that served as production centers for blessed ammunition and other war materials. Religious practice had evolved to meet the demands of constant warfare against supernatural enemies. New prayers, rituals, and ceremonies had been developed specifically for battlefield use, while traditional religious observances had been modified to provide practical spiritual protection. The church hierarchy had become largely militarized, with bishops serving as generals and priests functioning as both spiritual guides and tactical advisors. The psychological toll of 8 centuries of warfare against supernatural enemies had left deep marks on human civilization. Mental illness, spiritual corruption, and despair were constant threats that required specialized treatment, combining medical and religious approaches. Entire monastic orders were dedicated to caring for those broken by exposure to Hell's influence. Despite these challenges, human civilization had not merely survived, but had developed remarkable resilience and innovation in response to seemingly impossible odds. The war had forced humanity to explore the limits of both scientific achievement and spiritual devotion, creating technologies and techniques that might never have been developed under peaceful conditions. Chapter 17. The 6 factions in detail. By 1914, the Great War had crystallized around 6 major factions, each representing different approaches to the fundamental conflict between good and evil. These factions, while sometimes cooperating against common threats, maintained distinct identities, tactics, and philosophies that shaped their participation in the ongoing struggle. The Principality of New Antioch stood as the primary bastion of organized Christian resistance. Built on the ruins of the original Antioch and funded by tithes from every Christian nation, New Antioch represented the international unity that was necessary to stand against Hell's forces. The Principality's military was characterized by disciplined combined arms tactics, advanced technology, and elite units like the Meta-Christ communicants who served as supernatural shock troops. New Antioch's forces emphasized firepower and coordinated assaults, using their superior equipment and training to overcome Hell's supernatural advantages through sheer professional competence. Their fire team's rule allowed multiple units to activate together, creating devastating combined attacks that could overwhelm even powerful demonic opponents. The presence of combat engineers specialized in mine warfare and fortification construction reflected the technical nature of modern trench warfare. The city itself served as both fortress and symbol, its walls incorporating 8 centuries of military engineering knowledge, along with spiritual protections designed specifically to repel demonic assault. The fact that these walls had never been breached, despite countless attacks, had made New Antioch a symbol of hope for Christians worldwide. The Iron Sultanate represented the Islamic response to Hell's invasion, protected behind the divine Iron Wall, but still actively participating in the broader struggle. Their forces emphasized mobility, alchemical warfare, and precision strikes rather than the grinding attrition that characterized European fighting. The Sultanate's unique technologies, including the artificial Jabirian battle lions and time-manipulating assassins, gave them capabilities that no other faction could match. The Sultanate's military philosophy centered on merit-based leadership and diverse tactics. Their Yüzbaşı field commanders were selected purely on ability, creating a professional officer corps that combined traditional Islamic military virtues with innovative approaches to supernatural warfare. The integration of Jabirian alchemists into their military structure provided them with weapons and capabilities that blurred the line between science and magic. The Trench Pilgrims represented the grassroots Christian response, groups of faithful civilians who had taken up arms under the guidance of self-proclaimed prophets and divine visions. While lacking the formal organization of New Antioch or the advanced technology of the Sultanate, the Pilgrims possessed an intensity of faith that made them nearly fearless in battle and seemingly provided genuine supernatural protection. Their military effectiveness came not from superior equipment or training, but from absolute conviction and willingness to sacrifice everything for their cause. War prophets could inspire their followers to extraordinary feats through religious fervor, while specialized units like the Shrine Anchorites served as walking focal points for spiritual power that could turn battles through pure faith. The Heretic Legions formed the backbone of Hell's mortal forces, composed of humans who had chosen damnation in exchange for power. These forces combined conventional military capabilities with supernatural corruption, creating armies that retained human intelligence and adaptability, while possessing abilities that no mortal force should wield. The Legion's strength lay in their flexibility, and the fact that their soldiers fought with the desperation of the truly damned. Heretic priests could manipulate both friend and foe through their mastery of profane magics, while specialized units like death commandos and artillery witches provided capabilities that conventional armies could not counter through normal means. The court of the Seven-Headed Serpent represented Hell's direct military intervention, fielding actual demons alongside corrupted human allies. These forces possessed overwhelming individual power, but suffered from the same internal conflicts that plagued Hell's political structure. Hell Knights and other demonic warriors could devastate conventional forces, but their constant infighting often prevented coordinated strategic action. The court's approach to warfare emphasized psychological terror and overwhelming supernatural power rather than tactical sophistication. Their Gothic magic could bend reality itself, but the need to fuel these abilities with mortal suffering created strategic limitations that clever opponents could exploit. The cult of the Black Grail operated according to entirely different principles, spreading through infection and corruption rather than conventional conquest. Their forces consisted primarily of plague victims animated by demonic will, led by those depraved enough to willingly embrace Beelzebub's corruption. While individually weaker than other factions' elite units, the cult's ability to turn enemy casualties into new recruits made them a persistent threat that could never be completely eliminated. Each faction had developed unique approaches to the common challenges of the Great War, creating a complex strategic environment where temporary alliances could form against immediate threats, while fundamental ideological differences prevented permanent peace. The interaction between these factions' different military philosophies, technologies, and supernatural capabilities had driven 8 centuries of innovation and adaptation that showed no signs of slowing. Chapter 18. Daily life in a world at war. 8 centuries of continuous warfare against supernatural enemies had fundamentally altered how human civilization functioned at every level. The ordinary experience of daily life bore little resemblance to peaceful times, as every aspect of existence had been shaped by the constant need to survive in a world where hell itself sought to destroy all creation. In the Christian territories, children grew up with warfare as the fundamental reality of existence. Education systems had been restructured to combine traditional academic learning with military training and spiritual preparation. Young students learned to read using texts that included tactical manuals and religious works designed to provide protection against demonic influence. Mathematics lessons incorporated ballistics calculations and resource management for siege conditions. Religious observance had become far more intense and practical than in peaceful times. Daily prayers included specific requests for protection against supernatural threats, while weekly services often resembled military briefings as much as worship. Churches were designed as fortified positions that could serve as rallying points during attacks, with blessed weapons stored alongside religious artifacts. The economy had been completely militarized, with virtually every industry serving the war effort either directly or indirectly. Farmers worked in fortified agricultural communes, their crops blessed against corruption, and their harvest schedules coordinated with military operations. Craftsmen specialized in blessed weapons, protective amulets, and other items needed for supernatural warfare. Trade routes required military escorts and followed paths determined more by defensive considerations than economic efficiency. Merchants had to be experts in identifying signs of demonic corruption, as a single infected cargo could doom an entire city. Currency systems had adapted to include blessed coins and notes that could resist supernatural counterfeiting attempts. Medical practice had evolved into a complex discipline that combined traditional healing with spiritual cleansing and supernatural defense. Physicians required training in both anatomy and demonology, as wounds inflicted by Hell's forces often carried corruption that could spread if not properly treated. Hospitals were built as heavily fortified complexes with their own chaplains, blessed water supplies, and specialized equipment for dealing with supernatural ailments. Marriage and family life had been shaped by the constant threat of death and corruption. Wedding ceremonies included vows to protect each other from spiritual as well as physical danger, while marriage contracts often specified procedures for dealing with demonic possession or corruption of either spouse. Children were baptized with extra protective rites, and families maintained blessed sanctuaries within their homes where they could retreat during supernatural attacks. The legal system had developed entirely new categories of crime related to demonic influence and supernatural warfare. Courts employed specialists in detecting spiritual corruption, while punishment systems had to account for criminals who might be acting under demonic compulsion rather than their own free will. The concept of sanctuary had been expanded to include protection from supernatural as well as temporal authorities. Social structures had become more rigid and hierarchical, as the need for immediate obedience during emergencies made traditional feudal relationships more practical than democratic alternatives. However, these hierarchies were based more on proven competence in warfare and spiritual strength than on hereditary nobility, creating opportunities for advancement that might not have existed in peaceful times. Entertainment and culture had adapted to serve morale and educational purposes rather than mere pleasure. Popular songs included hymns that could provide spiritual protection, while theatrical performances often served as training exercises for recognizing and resisting demonic influence. Literature focused on moral instruction and tactical knowledge, with romantic stories taking second place to survival guides. Architecture had been revolutionized by the need to create structures that could withstand both conventional assault and supernatural attack. Buildings incorporated blessed materials, protective symbols, and defensive features as standard elements. Urban planning centered around creating interlocking fields of fire and multiple fallback positions, with entire cities designed as fortress complexes. Transportation systems had to account for the possibility of supernatural interference with conventional vehicles and navigation methods. Roads included way station shrines that provided both physical rest and spiritual cleansing for travelers. Maps indicated not just geographic features, but also areas of known demonic activity and safe routes for different times of year. Agricultural practices had been modified to deal with soil that might be corrupted by supernatural influence and crops that could be targeted by demonic sabotage. Farmers used blessed seeds, maintained protective shrines in their fields, and coordinated their planting and harvesting with religious calendars designed to minimize supernatural interference. Communication networks relied heavily on religious institutions, as churches provided both the infrastructure and the spiritual protection necessary for reliable message transmission across long distances. The church mail system had become one of the most important civilian institutions, connecting communities that might otherwise be isolated by the dangers of travel. Sleep patterns had adapted to the reality that some supernatural threats were more active during certain hours. Many communities observed modified schedules that concentrated vulnerable activities during daylight hours while maintaining enhanced vigilance during periods of increased demonic activity. Chapter 19. The Mercenaries and Specialized Forces. The Great War's complexity and duration had given rise to numerous specialized military units and mercenary companies that operated outside the traditional faction structures. These forces provided capabilities that were too specialized or morally questionable for regular military units, while also offering opportunities for skilled individuals to profit from their expertise in supernatural warfare. Mentalist Ammo monks represented one of the most valuable specialized services available to Christian forces. These monks combined religious devotion with technical expertise in creating custom ammunition blessed for specific purposes. Their holy ammunition could increase weapon effectiveness, add explosive properties, or provide enhanced damage against particular types of supernatural enemies. The monks operated as both suppliers and advisors, moving between different military units to provide their specialized services where they were most needed. Gothic warlocks occupied the morally ambiguous middle ground between faithful and heretic forces. These practitioners of forbidden magic had learned to harness Hell's own power without fully surrendering their souls to damnation. Their abilities made them valuable allies, but their methods made them suspect in the eyes of orthodox religious authorities. Many served as mercenaries, offering their dangerous services to whoever could meet their price, while maintaining careful distance from both sides' leadership. The sniper priests of various Christian denominations had developed supernatural marksmanship abilities through spiritual discipline and divine favor. These blind marksmen could strike targets at impossible ranges with uncanny accuracy, their spiritual sight proving more reliable than physical vision in the chaos of supernatural warfare. Their services were in constant demand for eliminating high-value demonic targets and providing overwatch for critical operations. Artillery specialists had become essential for dealing with the massive creatures and fortifications that characterized modern supernatural warfare. These experts combined traditional gunnery skills with knowledge of blessed ammunition, consecrated targeting methods, and the specialized techniques needed to engage enemies that might exist partially in other dimensions. Their equipment included not just conventional cannons, but also blessed siege engines and weapons powered by sacred relics. Battlefield medics faced unique challenges when treating wounds inflicted by supernatural weapons. The Sisters of St. Cosmas exemplified this specialized medical corps, taking modified Hippocratic oaths that compelled them to heal any wounded faithful while showing no mercy to enemies they encountered. Their combat surgical knives served dual purposes as medical instruments and blessed weapons, reflecting the dual nature of their battlefield role. Exorcist units had evolved from traditional religious practitioners into elite special forces capable of combating demonic possession on a tactical level. These specialists could cleanse corrupted areas, free possessed soldiers, and provide spiritual first aid in situations where conventional chaplains would be insufficient. Their training combined theological study with combat expertise, as they often had to fight their way to victims before beginning the exorcism process. Intelligence specialists faced the unique challenge of gathering information about enemies that could corrupt observers through mere contact. These operatives required not just conventional spy skills, but also spiritual protection and the ability to resist supernatural influence while maintaining their cover. Many carried suicide devices blessed by high-ranking clergy, as capture by Hell's forces could result in fates worse than death. Communication specialists maintained the blessed telegraph networks and consecrated radio systems that allowed coordination across the vast battlefields of the Great War. Their equipment required constant spiritual maintenance and protection against demonic interference. While their operators needed training in both technical and religious procedures to keep the networks functioning. Demolition experts had adapted their trade to deal with structures that might be protected by supernatural forces or built using non-physical principles. Their explosives were often blessed or included holy components, while their techniques incorporated prayers and rituals alongside conventional engineering knowledge. Some specialized in destroying demonic constructs that could regenerate from conventional damage. Scout units operating in no man's land required extraordinary courage and specialized training to survive in territories where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. These reconnaissance specialists used a combination of stealth techniques, spiritual protection, and supernatural detection methods to gather intelligence while avoiding the countless horrors that stalked the wasteland. Logistics specialists had perhaps the most challenging job of any support personnel, as they had to maintain supply lines across territories where conventional transportation methods might fail without warning. Their convoys included blessed vehicles, protective escorts, and emergency procedures for dealing with supernatural interdiction of supply routes. The relationship between these specialized forces and the major factions was complex and often fluid. While most maintained primary loyalties to particular sides, the specialized nature of their skills meant they often worked with multiple factions depending on current needs and payment arrangements. This created an informal network of military professionals whose expertise transcended factional boundaries. Many of these specialists had developed their own professional organizations and training systems, passing down knowledge and techniques that were too specialized for inclusion in regular military curricula. These professional brotherhoods provided both quality control and mutual support for individuals operating in the most dangerous aspects of supernatural warfare. Chapter 20. The Kola Peninsula. Hellgate and Secondary Incursions. While the original Gate of Hell in Jerusalem remained the primary source of infernal incursion, the Great War's progression had seen the opening of secondary Hellgates that created new fronts and challenges for the defending forces. The most significant of these was the Kola Peninsula Hellgate, which opened in the far north of Scandinavia and created an entirely different type of supernatural threat. The Kola Peninsula Hellgate differed from the Jerusalem Gate in several crucial ways. Rather than being a permanent opening, it operated sporadically, remaining dormant for years or even decades before suddenly erupting with fresh waves of infernal forces. This unpredictability made it impossible to establish permanent defenses comparable to those around Jerusalem, forcing the creation of rapid response forces that could deploy to the region when the gate showed signs of activity. The creatures that emerged from the Kola Peninsula Gate were adapted to the harsh northern climate, representing different circles of hell than those that dominated the Middle Eastern fronts. Ice demons and frost-covered undead poured forth during active periods, bringing supernatural winter that could freeze entire regions and creating conditions that challenged even the hardy Scandinavian populations that had learned to survive in this environment. The Norse and other Scandinavian peoples had developed unique approaches to combating these northern infernal incursions. Their traditional warrior cultures adapted surprisingly well to fighting supernatural enemies, with berserker traditions providing natural resistance to fear-based demonic attacks. However, the region's sparse population and limited resources made it difficult to maintain the kind of massive defensive installations that protected other fronts. Ireland had fallen to a major heretic invasion during the 19th century, when Hell's forces opened a temporary gate to support a massive amphibious assault on the British Isles. This attack had been carefully coordinated with the Year of Broken Trinity to maximize its impact when Christian leadership was in chaos following the assassination of key religious and political figures. The Irish invasion demonstrated Hell's ability to open temporary gates in strategic locations, bypassing the heavily defended land approaches to strike at targets that had previously been considered secure. The assault force included specialized naval units and amphibious demons capable of operating in marine environments, representing a significant evolution in Hell's military capabilities. The loss of Ireland forced England to fundamentally reconsider its naval strategy and coastal defences. The construction of the moving fortress Britannia represented Admiral Nelson's dying vision of a mobile stronghold that could respond to threats anywhere along the British coast. This massive vessel, more floating city than conventional warship, incorporated the lessons learned from Ireland's fall and served as both symbol and practical embodiment of British determination to prevent further losses. Scotland's survival as an independent kingdom was largely due to its rapid adaptation to the new threat environment. The Scottish Highlands provided natural defensive terrain that was difficult for conventional invading forces to navigate, while the clan system's emphasis on local autonomy allowed for flexible response to supernatural threats that might overwhelm more centralized command structures. Other secondary incursions had occurred throughout the war's 8-century duration, each requiring adapted responses and creating new challenges for the defending forces. These events demonstrated that Hell's strategists were constantly seeking new approaches to break the stalemate that had developed around the major fixed defensive positions. The pattern of secondary incursions had forced all major powers to maintain strategic reserves and rapid response capabilities rather than concentrating all their forces on fixed defensive lines. This requirement for strategic flexibility had contributed to the development of more professional military institutions and the evolution of combined arms tactics that could adapt to widely varying threat environments. Intelligence gathering about potential secondary incursion sites had become a major priority for all faithful factions. This required not just conventional espionage, but also supernatural detection methods and monitoring of spiritual disturbances across vast geographic areas. Some military scholars theorize that the development of early warning systems capable of detecting the signs that preceded gate openings had become crucial for survival, though the exact methods remain highly classified. The existence of multiple fronts and the possibility of new ones opening without warning had prevented any faction from achieving decisive victory despite centuries of warfare. Military historians note that just as one front might stabilize, new threats would emerge elsewhere, forcing the redeployment of forces and the constant adaptation of strategies and tactics. Chapter 21. Theological Implications and Religious Evolution. 8 centuries of warfare against literal forces of hell had profound implications for Christian theology and religious practice that extended far beyond military considerations. The Church had been forced to confront theological questions that would have been purely academic in peaceful times, while developing new doctrines and practices that reflected the reality of supernatural warfare. The existence of demons as literal, physical enemies, rather than abstract spiritual concepts, required fundamental re-examination of traditional theological frameworks. Questions about the nature of evil, the relationship between spiritual and physical reality, and the mechanisms of divine intervention took on immediate practical importance when the wrong answers could result in military defeat and the damnation of entire populations. The Meta-Christ program represented perhaps the most controversial theological innovation of the entire war period. The Church's decision to clone Christ himself raised unprecedented questions about the nature of divine incarnation, the uniqueness of Christ's sacrifice, and the limits of human authority in spiritual matters. Supporters argued that God had provided both the means and the necessity for this program, while critics maintained that attempting to replicate Christ's physical form bordered on blasphemy. The development of new biblical texts, including the Novi Revelations, battle psalms, cataclysms, and divinations, reflected the Church's need to address situations that had no precedent in traditional scripture. These additions to the new Orthodox syncretic Bible provided both practical guidance for supernatural warfare and theological justification for measures that would have been unthinkable in peaceful times. The concept of divine intervention had been complicated by God's apparent decision to work primarily through indirect means rather than direct miraculous action. While the Iron Wall of Iskandar and the destruction of Argos demonstrated that divine power remained active in the world, the rarity and unpredictability of such interventions forced believers to rely primarily on their own efforts, while maintaining faith that their struggles served a larger divine purpose. The Church's relationship with scientific advancement had evolved in ways that would have been impossible without the war's pressures. Traditional tensions between faith and reason had been largely resolved by the practical necessity of using every available tool against hell's forces. Scientific research was not only permitted but encouraged when it served the cause of defending creation against damnation. The role of martyrdom had been redefined by the reality that death in this war might not lead to immediate salvation if proper spiritual precautions were not taken. The fate of the 17 martyrs, eternally tortured but spiritually unbroken, provided a complex model that combined traditional martyrdom concepts with the practical reality that hell could prevent souls from reaching their eternal reward. Religious orders had been militarized to a degree unknown in peaceful times, with monks and nuns serving as soldiers, scientists, and specialists in supernatural warfare. The traditional monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience had been supplemented with additional commitments related to military service and the defense of Christendom against infernal forces. The concept of just war had expanded to encompass measures that would have been considered excessive or immoral under normal circumstances. The Church had developed extensive doctrinal frameworks justifying the use of weapons that might cause civilian casualties, tactics that involve deception or assassination, and alliances with morally questionable mercenary forces when such measures were necessary for survival. Confession and absolution had evolved to address sins and spiritual contamination that had no precedent in traditional moral theology. Priests required training in recognizing and treating demonic influence, spiritual corruption, and the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to supernatural horror. New categories of sin had been developed to address the unique moral challenges of supernatural warfare. The afterlife itself had become more complex, as the war had demonstrated that souls could be prevented from reaching their intended destinations through demonic intervention. This had led to the development of new prayers, rituals, and protective measures designed to ensure that the faithful dead could successfully navigate the spiritual dangers that hell had created to intercept departing souls. Prayer itself had become more practical and specific, with standardized prayers for protection against particular types of supernatural threats. The traditional liturgical calendar had been supplemented with military-specific observances and saint days dedicated to those who had distinguished themselves in supernatural warfare. The relationship between different Christian denominations had been affected by the need for unity against external threats, but also complicated by disagreements about proper responses to unprecedented theological challenges. The wars of Triclavianism had demonstrated the dangers of religious division, but underlying doctrinal differences remained and sometimes surfaced during periods of reduced external pressure. Chapter 22: Cultural Impact and Artistic Expression. The Great War's influence extended far beyond military and religious spheres into every aspect of human cultural expression. Art, literature, music, and other forms of creative endeavor had been fundamentally shaped by 8 centuries of struggle against supernatural enemies, creating cultural forms that would have been impossible in peaceful times. Visual arts had evolved to serve both aesthetic and practical purposes, with religious iconography incorporating protective symbols and blessed materials that could provide genuine spiritual defense. Church frescoes and stained glass windows were designed not just to inspire devotion, but to create consecrated spaces that were hostile to demonic presence. Secular art often focused on themes of resistance, sacrifice, and the triumph of faith over adversity. Architecture had been revolutionized by the need to create structures that could withstand both conventional assault and supernatural attack. Gothic revival styles had evolved to incorporate defensive features alongside their traditional spiritual symbolism, while new architectural forms had emerged that combined fortress design with religious requirements. The great cathedrals built during the war period served as both worship spaces and military strongholds. Literature had developed new genres specifically related to supernatural warfare, including tactical manuals disguised as adventure stories, theological treatises presented as epic poems, and survival guides written as romantic narratives. The epic poem had made a strong comeback as a means of preserving military knowledge and inspiring courage through accounts of heroic deeds against impossible odds. Music had evolved to include battle hymns that could provide spiritual protection during combat, marching songs that incorporated protective prayers, and liturgical compositions designed to strengthen the faithful's resistance to demonic influence. Military bands included chaplains alongside musicians, as the spiritual dimension of their performance was considered as important as its aesthetic value. Theatre had become heavily focused on moral instruction and preparation for spiritual warfare. Popular plays often featured scenarios where characters had to choose between salvation and damnation, providing audiences with examples of proper behavior under supernatural pressure. Mystery plays had evolved to include actual theological instruction alongside their dramatic content. Folk traditions had adapted to incorporate knowledge about supernatural threats alongside traditional seasonal celebrations and agricultural practices. Fairy tales had become darker and more practical, teaching children to recognize signs of demonic influence and providing models for resistance against supernatural corruption. Traditional festivals had been modified to include protective rituals and community-wide spiritual cleansing ceremonies. Dance had evolved to include ritual movements that were believed to provide protection against spiritual attack. Military units often practiced synchronized movements that served both ceremonial and practical purposes, as the discipline required for complex group performances was thought to strengthen resistance against demonic mental influence. Craftsmanship had been elevated to near-artistic status when it involved the creation of blessed weapons, protective amulets, and other items needed for supernatural warfare. Master craftsmen were revered not just for their technical skill, but for their spiritual dedication, as the creation of effective blessed items required both physical expertise and religious devotion. Storytelling traditions had been preserved and adapted to serve educational purposes, with traditional tales being modified to include practical lessons about surviving supernatural encounters. Professional storytellers served important social functions by preserving cultural memory while providing entertainment that could maintain morale during difficult periods. Fashion had evolved to incorporate protective elements alongside aesthetic considerations. Clothing included hidden blessed symbols, jewelry incorporated protective stones and metals, and even hairstyles might include religious elements designed to provide spiritual defense. The distinction between functional and decorative elements had become increasingly blurred. Culinary traditions had adapted to incorporate blessed ingredients and preparation methods designed to provide both physical nourishment and spiritual protection. Certain foods were avoided due to their association with demonic corruption, while others were specially prepared for their protective properties. Religious fasting had evolved to include specific dietary requirements for those engaged in supernatural warfare. Games and sports had been modified to serve training purposes while maintaining their entertainment value. Traditional competitions had been supplemented with exercises designed to develop skills useful in supernatural warfare, while new games had been created that combined physical challenges with spiritual tests. The preservation of cultural heritage had become a military priority, as Hell's forces specifically targeted libraries, museums, and other repositories of human knowledge and achievement. Special units were dedicated to protecting cultural artifacts, while techniques had been developed for hiding and preserving important works during periods of intense fighting. Chapter 23. The Economics of Eternal War. 8 centuries of continuous warfare had created economic systems unlike anything that had existed in peaceful times. The Great War's demands had forced the development of industrial capacity, trade networks, and financial institutions specifically designed to support supernatural warfare while maintaining civilian populations under constant threat. The war economy was characterized by the need to produce specialized equipment that required both conventional manufacturing techniques and religious consecration. This created complex supply chains that included not just raw materials and skilled labor, but also clergy capable of blessing finished products and materials blessed for use in sacred applications. Currency systems had evolved to accommodate the unique requirements of supernatural warfare. New Antioch's gold ducat had become the standard international currency among faithful nations, not just because of economic stability, but because the coins themselves were blessed during minting and could serve as components in various protective rituals. The standardized weight and purity of these coins made them reliable both as money and as sources of blessed metal. Banking and finance had adapted to deal with the reality that normal economic calculations might be disrupted by supernatural interference. Financial institutions maintained blessed vaults protected against demonic influence, while loan agreements included clauses addressing supernatural force majeure situations. Interest rates had to account for the possibility that borrowers might be killed, corrupted, or possessed before loans could be repaid. Trade routes required massive security investments that fundamentally altered the economics of commerce. Merchant convoys included military escorts, blessed cargo containers, and spiritual advisors alongside traditional commercial personnel. The cost of these protective measures was reflected in dramatically higher prices for goods that had to travel through dangerous territories. Manufacturing had been revolutionized by the need to incorporate blessed materials and production processes into conventional industrial techniques. Factories required on-site chapels and chaplains, while production schedules had to accommodate religious observances and blessing ceremonies. Quality control included spiritual as well as technical testing to ensure that finished products would function properly in supernatural environments. Agriculture faced unique challenges in territories where soil might be corrupted by supernatural influence, and crops could be targeted by demonic sabotage. Farming communities had to invest heavily in protective measures, including blessed seeds, consecrated irrigation systems, and defensive fortifications around agricultural areas. The uncertainty of harvest yields due to supernatural interference created volatile food markets. Mining operations in areas close to Hell's influence dealt with ore that might be corrupted or possessed by demonic forces. Miners required spiritual as well as physical protection, while extracted materials had to be tested and purified before they could be safely used in manufacturing. Some mines had been completely abandoned due to supernatural contamination that made extraction impossible. Transportation networks had evolved to accommodate both conventional cargo and the specialized requirements of supernatural warfare. Roads included way station shrines that provided both rest stops and spiritual cleansing for travelers, while bridges and tunnels incorporated protective symbols and were regularly blessed by traveling clergy. Insurance had become a major industry due to the unpredictable nature of supernatural threats. Policies covered not just conventional risks, but also demonic attack, spiritual corruption, and other supernatural disasters. The calculation of premiums required expertise in both actuarial science and theology, as traditional risk assessment methods were insufficient for supernatural threats. Labor markets had been affected by the need for workers with specialized skills related to supernatural warfare. Traditional crafts had evolved to include blessed weaponsmithing, protective amulet creation, and other supernatural applications. Professional guilds had developed training programs that combined technical instruction with religious education. International trade had been complicated by the need to ensure that imported goods were not carrying supernatural contamination from their points of origin. Customs procedures included spiritual inspection alongside conventional examination, while quarantine facilities had to be blessed and staffed with clergy as well as medical personnel. The development of industrial capacity specifically for supernatural warfare had created entirely new industries. Manufacturers of blessed ammunition, consecrated medical supplies, and supernatural detection equipment had no peacetime equivalents. These industries required investment in both conventional production facilities and the religious infrastructure needed to bless their products. Resource allocation had become a matter of survival rather than economic optimization. Strategic materials needed for supernatural warfare received priority regardless of normal market forces, while entire industries were dedicated to supporting the war effort even when this was economically inefficient by traditional measures. Chapter 24: The Future of the Conflict. As the Great War entered its 9th century in 1914, none of the major participants showed signs of achieving decisive victory. The conflict had evolved into a complex stalemate where technological advancement, supernatural innovation, and strategic adaptation occurred on all sides simultaneously, preventing any faction from gaining permanent advantage. The opening of secondary Hellgates had demonstrated that Hell's strategists were constantly seeking new approaches to break the deadlock. The unpredictable nature of these incursions meant that no amount of fixed fortification could provide complete security, forcing all faithful factions to maintain expensive rapid response capabilities while still defending their primary territories. Technological development showed no signs of slowing, with each side's innovations forcing their enemies to develop countermeasures in an endless cycle of military evolution. The introduction of tanks, submarines, aircraft, and other modern weapons had been accelerated by the war's demands, while supernatural technologies continued to advance alongside conventional military science. The demographic impact of 8 centuries of warfare was beginning to show signs of strain on all sides. While new generations continued to be born and trained for warfare, the constant casualty rates were creating labor shortages and social stresses that affected military effectiveness. The need to maintain both military forces and civilian populations under constant threat was becoming increasingly difficult. Religious and ideological factors suggested that the conflict was unlikely to end through negotiation or compromise. The fundamental nature of the war as a struggle between salvation and damnation made peaceful coexistence impossible, while the supernatural elements meant that normal diplomatic solutions were inadequate to address the underlying causes of conflict. The expansion of the war beyond its original Middle Eastern focus had created a global conflict that affected every inhabited continent. The involvement of African kingdoms, Asian powers, and other regions meant that the war's resolution would require victory on a planetary scale rather than in any single theater of operations. Economic factors were beginning to create pressures for change, as the cost of maintaining 8 centuries of total war was straining even the most prosperous nations. However, the existential nature of the threat meant that economic considerations remained secondary to survival, and there was little prospect of war weariness forcing peace when the alternative was damnation. The role of divine intervention remained unpredictable, with documented cases like the Iron Wall of Iskandar and the destruction of Argos demonstrating that divine power remained active in the world. However, the rarity and unpredictable nature of such interventions meant that believers had to rely primarily on their own efforts while maintaining faith that their struggles served a larger divine purpose. The development of increasingly powerful weapons and supernatural abilities on both sides created the possibility that future conflicts might escalate beyond the current war's already extreme level of destruction. The existence of weapons capable of destroying entire cities as had happened to Argos, suggested that even more catastrophic escalation remained possible. Intelligence about Hell's ultimate objectives remained limited, making it difficult to develop long-term strategies that could address the war's root causes rather than merely responding to immediate threats. The demon's motivations and long-term plans were not fully understood by mortal strategists, creating uncertainty about what victory would actually require. The emergence of new supernatural threats, such as the various plague outbreaks and the appearance of increasingly powerful demonic creatures, suggested that Hell's capabilities were still evolving. This made it difficult to predict what new challenges the faithful might face in future decades or centuries. The war's impact on human civilization had been so profound that it was unclear whether peace would even be possible after 8 centuries of total militarization. The economic, social, and cultural adaptations required for supernatural warfare had become so deeply embedded in human society that transitioning to peacetime conditions might prove impossible, even if the external threat were eliminated. However, the war had also demonstrated humanity's remarkable capacity for adaptation, innovation, and resistance under seemingly impossible circumstances. The survival of Christian, Islamic, and other civilizations after 8 centuries of assault by supernatural enemies had proven that faith, courage, and determination could prevail against overwhelming odds. The development of new technologies, tactics, and forms of cooperation had shown that humans could evolve to meet challenges that would have seemed insurmountable to previous generations. Conclusion: the eternal struggle. And so concludes our deep dive into the complete story of Trench Crusade, a universe where faith and horror exist in constant tension. We've discovered how a single act of heresy in 1099 transformed human civilization into something unrecognizable, where children learn prayers alongside tactics, and where the dead do not always stay buried. We've explored the 6 great factions locked in this endless struggle, from the stalwart defenders of New Antioch to the plague-spreading servants of the Black Grail, each representing different aspects of humanity's response to ultimate evil. The legacy of the Knights Templar's betrayal continues to shape this world over 8 centuries later, as their descendants in the Heretic Legions serve masters they chose in their greed and weakness. Yet humanity endures, adapts, and fights back with innovations that blend cutting-edge science with ancient faith, creating warriors who wield blessed weapons alongside supernatural allies. Perhaps most remarkably, we've seen how this eternal war has not broken the human spirit, but transformed it, creating new forms of courage, devotion, and unity in the face of literal damnation. The Meta-Christ program, the Iron Wall's divine protection, and the countless acts of heroism by ordinary people elevated to extraordinary circumstances all demonstrate that even in the darkest timeline imaginable, hope persists. The world of Trench Crusade reminds us that the greatest battles are often fought not for territory or resources, but for the very soul of civilization itself. In its trenches filled with both mud and miracles, we see reflected our own struggles against the darkness that threatens to overwhelm human decency and divine purpose. Next time on Lore 2 RPG, we'll explore another universe where ordinary heroes face impossible odds. Until then, keep exploring those epic tales, fellow adventurers, and remember that even in the deepest trenches, faith can still light the way forward. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the complete story of Trench Crusade. If you enjoyed this comprehensive exploration of one of gaming's most unique and harrowing universes, please like this video and subscribe for more in-depth examinations of gaming's greatest stories. Your support helps us continue creating these detailed explorations of the rich narratives that make gaming such a compelling medium for storytelling.